So let's just start at the very beginning. Describe what you remember of your early childhood, just in terms of music. What were the first musical influences?
My first big influence was Bing Crosby. They were, in the 20s, of course, we only had one radio in the house in Washington Heights. And my mother and father were fans of a radio show called Easy Aces. It was a rather advanced, highly evolved humor. Goodman Ace, who later on became rather a well-known writer for people like Bob Hope and many screen people. You'll see his credits. And it would go on at 6:45, and we'd have our dinner at 6 o'clock. However, at 6:45, Bing Crosby came on, and I was co-opted with Easy Aces. So my pal Cy Ampol and I would make our way several blocks to the east to a sporting goods store called the Vegas, and in the vestibule, they had a big console radio, and there would Bing would come on. And I was just crazy about Bing. I still know all of his songs. I know all the lyrics. And then the next thing that came along was big band broadcasts. Probably the earliest big band that I could remember was maybe Don Redman, who had an orchestra of some repute, but was better known for the arrangements he did for Fletcher Henderson. Now, I suppose some of these talismanic names would be like talking about Neanderthal cave people to most of the listeners, but as Casey Stengel said, you could look it up. The Fletcher Henderson Band, the Jimmy Lunsford Band. Like I say, I remember Don Redman doing what they call remote broadcasts at night. I'd have the radio on under the blanket so that parents wouldn't come in and turn me off. So really the childhood influences were Bing Crosby and the remote broadcasts. When I got, let's say, to the age of late teens, 17 and 18, I learned about traditional jazz. It was traditional then because it was happening, and there was very little before it. When you say traditional now, you're thinking of something from the Pleistocene era, some distant early time. But the strange thing is that I probably started listening to records and collecting records in about 1935 or 36, which would make me 17 or 18. And hey, we got Big Ben here, what can I tell you? It would make me about 17 or 18. And I started collecting jazz, traditional jazz records, which at that time would be a little more than 10 years old. I mean, because when you talk about 37 or 38, the earliest collectible recordings probably were 24 to 26. Louis Armstrong, Hot 5, Hot 7, Bessie Smith, King Oliver, Sidney Bechet. And we used to go chasing these records in all sorts of odd places, which I'm sure some of the other people you've interviewed have described to you.
Was Russ Sanjak one of your...
Russ Sanjak was my tightest buddy. And did you get Russ Sanjak on tape?
I haven't, but I was speaking with David yesterday.
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, he just died too young. He was my best collecting buddy, and he was my best friend in those days. And I know people like George Avakian, you may have interviewed, and so on, will tell you how we used to go scouting and looking for used record stores, usually under an elevated railroad line. Is this familiar to you? And we'd go in there into Salvation Army depots and old furniture stores and open up the Victrolas that they had there. And there would be these old 78s. Also, if you were really lucky, you would find a store maybe in the outer boroughs a record store that had been there for years and had a lot of records packed in the basement. And the labels were OK, and Brunswick, Vocalion, and especially the Jeanette label, where Big Spider Beck recorded, and the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, and Jelly Roll Morton. In fact, a book came out several years ago, and it had a big Jeanette octagonal green label on it. And it was the kind of thing that gave you a chill when you saw that label. Of course, you had to do a bit of discriminatory weeding, because there'd be a lot of John McCormick records among the King Olivers and the Big Spider Becks. So it became such a passion that the few of us who were doing this all got to know each other. It was a wee happy few little, enclave. And it included people like John Hammond, Bob Thiel, George Avakian, the late Russ Sanjak, who was a great pal of mine, the Erdogan brothers when they came to this country, Alfred Lyon, who started Blue Note on an inspired guess, and it became probably the treasure trove of traditional and modern jazz. And it's very interesting to me. And maybe you should go see Lorraine Gordon, who was Alfred Lyon's wife. She still is running the Village Vanguard, and she could give you a lot of stuff about the origins of Blue Note, and she's a friend of mine. And it's interesting that we all made the same transition from Dixieland, classic New Orleans, swing, small Holland combos, to bop and progressive jazz, and nobody did it more conspicuously and successfully than Alfred Lyon at Blue Note. My late lamented partner, Nestle Erdogan, was no slouch either, because he recorded everything from brass New Orleans marching band, which were marching bands which occasionally were even in tune, to not just bop, not to modern jazz, but to the most far-out kind of music, exemplified by Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane. This is an enormous swing in sensibility, and it covers so much ground that, except for ancient parties like myself, you very rarely see it personified today in anybody.
That music at the time was not commercial by any stretch of the imagination, was it?
Well, in a way it was and it wasn't, because there was a time when jazz was the pop music of the day. Let's say Benny Goodman, for example. Undeniably, it was a jazz orchestra or jazz band, and nevertheless, it was on the jukeboxes, and it was on the hit parade, and so jazz was the idiom for all too brief a time, and now, of course, has become a very specialized corner for the Illuminati. It's like you start on rock and roll, and when you grow up, you go to jazz.
You went the other way.
Right.
Some of the stores the Commodore Records was one of the stores.
Oh, Commodore, that was the Shrine with Milt Gabler, who's still a great friend of mine, and the man who I always idolized. We used to hang out at the Commodore and trade records, and Milt was a fan, even though he was an entrepreneur and he was in a business that had to make enough money to pay the rent. We would go out and we would find rare records, and we would trade them into Milt for credit or for other records that we wanted. I have always been, and still am, a great admirer of the late trumpet player Henry Red Allen, who a lot of people feel has been overlooked in the pantheon. A lot of people view him as just a Louis Armstrong clone, which he wasn't at all, because he had a whole different harmonic approach. from Louis. And there was a record that he did, a very early record in the 20s called Biffley Blues. And I'd always be showing up at the Commodore and pestering Milt to the point where he started calling me Biffley. Of course, eventually I found the record, and it's all been reissued on CD, and I recommend it highly, especially the Red Allen Pee Wee Russell series called The Rhythm Makers, which in the late 20s and early 30s, or the early 30s, I guess, exemplified some of the purest improvisational jazz with the greatest players. Red Allen and Pee Wee Russell are, two nonpareil. Pee Wee Russell on clarinet, of course. And so we all got to know each other and hanging out at the Commodore. As a matter of fact, a man named Arnold Shaw wrote a book called The Street That Never Slept. That was 52nd Street. And 52nd Street had all these terrific clubs, the Onyx and the Famous Door, and Jimmy Ryan's, and you had every variety of jazz. Before the war, it was all swing and small combo Harlem music. After the war, bop came in, and so bop would be in one place, and you could go hear Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and even the whole Count Basie band in a nightclub was no bigger than this room. You can imagine, in the ceiling, a very low ceiling, the brass section always had to, bend over so that they wouldn't be hitting the ceiling with their heads. So you had every variety of music on 52nd Street, and at the terminal end, at the Fifth Avenue end of 52nd Street, the southeast, toward the southeast corner was the Commodore Record Shop. And Milt Gabler used to run these fabulous jam sessions at Jimmy Ryan's. And if you were fortunate enough to have been there, it was the Periclean age, because you saw Louis Armstrong, Fats Waller, Jack Teagarden, Benny Goodman, Pee Wee Russell, Joe Sullivan. I don't know, Bessie Smith had already gone, but you saw the peerless Lee Wiley and Mildred Bailey. A litany of names that's all too forgotten these days, but they would be up there at jam sessions. Of course, Lester Young and Chu Berry and Coleman Hawkins, saxophone players. And I think they got like $5 a man, which was really good pay in those days, to play in the afternoon. The session would start sometime in the late afternoon and run for several hours. And in my recollection, it was the best live music in terms of the quality of the players and the freedom they had to play. And since improvisation has to be the main ingredient in jazz, I say the main ingredient, it all has to be in tune and in time. You have to know your instrument. It was some of the greatest jamming that you ever heard.
Of all that group of people, it seems astonishing that so many of them went on to great success.
I know, it's so amazing. We would be buying records, and we would buy current records too, as well as the classics. And I always had the demented notion that if I only had a chance, I could make better records than what I was hearing in the records I was buying. I was very quickly disabused of that notion when I became a partner in Atlantic Records and went into the studio for my first session, because it was deathly fear.
But long before that, you obviously got into writing about
yes.
music and so on.
Yes.
Was it early on, though, I mean, even though you went into writing, that you knew you wanted to make records? I mean,
No, I didn't know that whether I wanted to make records or not. I mean, this was just a fancy, It wasn't even what I would call I wasn't even motivated by the notion, because I didn't think it was possible.
But the other folks around you presumably were thinking in those terms.
I don't know. In those days, of course, the only one who was really doing it was John Hammond at that time, who started in 1928, commissioned by Sir Joseph Lockwood of a British record company to record certain American artists and orchestras which were not available. So that the earliest records, for example, of Fletcher Henderson, were done on commission by Sir Joseph Lockwood for Parlophone, and then came out in America. So John was the one, and he was our idol and our hero because he discovered Billie Holiday, took her into the studio with Benny Goodman. He convinced Benny Goodman to admit Negroes, as they were called in those days, the blacks, into his band. He produced Bessie Smith's Last Session in 1936 and went on not only in making these incredible jazz finds, but accomplished signing the likes of Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen. When John signed Bob Dylan, it was against the wishes of the entire record company. They were all lined up against him. Here's this guy with the twangy guitar playing 11-bar phrases and out of tune and so on and so on. This is crazy. So that Bob Dylan, that first year, was known as Hammond's Folly at Columbia Records.
Just as an aside, what was your first impression when you first heard Bob Dylan? Being an R&B man more.
I don't remember because at some point I came not only to like him, but to appreciate him as one of the three geniuses that I had the good fortune to go in the studio with, the other two being Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles. And the fourth one, possibility, who died too young, was Donny Hathaway. There was no limit to Donny Hathaway's talent, and I thought that he was going to be number 4. And there was quite a Donny Hathaway cult today among young people, and they realize his brilliance as a composer, keyboard man, and vocalist.
Aretha had very kind things to say about Donny Hathaway, too.
You know, when Aretha did Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which I produced, instead of the first verse being sung, I had Aretha and Donny trade 2- and 4-bar phrases between the organ and the piano, thereby eliminating a good part of the vocal, and I ducked Paul Simon. I didn't want to be held to account, but when he finally caught up with me, he said, "Fantastic, I love it." So Donny Hathaway was something incredible. But it started with Dylan. And
we started with John Hammond, actually.
Oh, actually, Dylan. And then, of course, then John brought in Bruce Springsteen. Now, how can you beat that kind of range and that kind of scope, going from Billie Holiday to Bruce Springsteen? And so John was the main man. Then, of course, George Avakian became a very important producer and vault man. He did the best reissues on Bessie Smith, for example, and Louis Armstrong. And he brought Earl Garner to the company. And then there was Bob Thiele, who is perhaps the most underrated. He's gone now. He died a few years ago. One of the most underrated record producers, because I think he and Milt Gabler made the most records in every area, in every field of anybody. Of course, Milt Gabler had such range when you realize that he did everybody from Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday to Bill Haley and the Four Aces. I mean, so while he was running the Commodore record shop, Decca hired him to be the head A&R man. And when Decca was acquired by MCA, I'll say this right out flat. The dumbest thing that MCA ever did was not immediately hire Milt Gabler to be in charge of their vaults, because they knew not what they had, and I don't know if they do to this day. So there was Milt, there was Alfred Lyon, who came here from Germany, attended a concert called Spirituals to Swing that John Hammond ran. And there was Joe Turner, I forget who was on the bill, but Robert Johnson was scheduled to appear, except the week or the day or two before the concert, he was extinguished by the farmer who found him in bed with his wife. So instead of having Robert Johnson actually at this session, which is well recorded, there were 2 Spirituals to Swing concerts. And the records are available today. I forget who John got. He got another blues singer to appear. But then also, now I don't know if this is apocryphal, as everybody knows, the Robert Johnsons were repackaged and sold enormously and even hit the pop charts a few years ago. And the story is that John Hammond found the masters in a trash can in an alley in back of Columbia Records. That's a real good story, you know, and even if it's true, all of these people, we had a little small confraternity, a We Happy Few, and we used to trade records. Commodore Music Shop was headquarters, but we also used to go to see live music together. And we used to have listening sessions. We'd go to somebody's house or somebody's apartment, and then we'd put on the records. Milt Gabler had a man assisting him at the Sunday night jam sessions, and the assistants usually consisted of bringing a couple of bottles of Jack Daniels for the musicians. His name was Henry Sklow. He was a dentist. He was an awfully hip dentist. And Henry lived in the northern Bronx, and every once in a while, on Pelham Parkway, a bunch of us would go up there just to have listening sessions. And the beverage of choice was McSorley's Ale. There was a wonderful saloon called McSorley's Saloon, which Joe Mitchell of the New Yorker wrote a great book about, McSorley's wonderful saloon. McSorley's Ale, and we had kosher Chinese egg rolls that were available, and the booze, and sometimes some cheroots without names on them. And we'd be playing these records, and it was just a delight. Oh, I forgot to mention one of the greatest of all the collectors and the man who started the independent recording. That's Dan Quayle. I don't know if that's a name you're familiar with, but he started a label called Solo Art Records, recording pianists, including Jimmy Yancey. Jimmy Yancey was one of the early boogie-woogie players. And this may be too technical, but the interesting about Jimmy Yancey, that instead of playing 8 in a bar, he played 6 in a bar, which had a sort of Latin effect. And Atlantic Records, a lot of the Atlantic rhythm lines were Yancey bass lines, 6-beat boogie. Dan Quayle went to Chicago and found him. He was a groundskeeper at the old White Sox baseball grounds. Hadn't touched the piano in 10 years. And Dan brought him into the studio and made a great series of records with him. The records, the masters now belong to a man named George Buck in New Orleans, who has a wonderful label, GHB Records. And he also recorded Yancey's wife, Ma Yancey. And before I came to Atlantic, Ahmet Ertegun and Herb Abramson, the original partners, they went out and found Jimmy and Ma Yancey, and they made a wonderful Yancey blues. And they were so impressed with the Yancey bass line because it was so different. It was a 6-beat figure against the 8-beat figure, which is much more familiar to boogie-woogie fans. So Dan Quayle died very young. He was an incredible Renaissance man. he was the most famous Brooklyn Dodger fan of the era. His picture would be taken with the ball players, and he would take me out to Ebbets Field in those days. And I remember he introduced me to Hugh Casey, whom, with his New York Irish accent, he affectionately dubbed Old Turlet Head, because Hugh Casey was a wonderful drunken pitcher of the era. And also to Pete Reiser, the great center fielder who ran into too many walls in the outfield. So Dan Quayle was terribly important, because I think he made the first independent records with people like Yancey, as well as Joe Sullivan, and a wonderful demented character named George Zach, and so on. But at this, so we now have to segue to after the war, I think. No, Cafe Society downtown was before the war. Okay.
Let me just ask you one other quick question.
Yeah.
Did Herb and Herb Abramson and Miriam, were they part of
Oh,
that?
absolutely.
That set?
Yeah, Herb and Miriam, absolutely. They were jazz collectors, blues collectors, and as I said in the eulogy I did for Nestle Erdogan, we all made hanging out into an art form, because hanging out, that's what you did.
But what, again, I mean, just before we move
Yeah.
on, did everyone have this driving ambition, not just to be fans, but to do something with it?
No, I mean, I don't think any of us ever even thought about it, except maybe Ahmed and Herb. Because Ahmed, coming from Europe, or from Turkey, and being raised in the capitals of Europe because his father was a diplomat, didn't know that it was impossible. So he went and started this label with Herb Abramson. Ahmed's father at this time was the Turkish ambassador to the United States. So Ahmed and Nestle grew up in this embassy, and they used to bring jazz players down to the embassy, and scandalize the officials at the embassy and all their neighbors by bringing in people like Coleman Hawkins and I don't know who all, Lips Page, for example, they told me about. There was another wonderful jazz musician. I had left Billboard in 1951, I think, and I was working for a music publisher at the time. And in 52, Ahmed and Herb offered me a job because they needed to replace a fellow named Nat Shapiro, who was doing some of their publishing and publicity and general promotion. Nat went on to become a representative of Michel Legrand, and also he represented the French songwriter who did all these songs about the realities of romance, and Jacques Brel. He brought Jacques Brel, the Jacques Brel musical play, to the Village Gate. And again, he's another one who passed away much too early. Anyhow, he was leaving, so they offered me the job. And I said, not for me, fellas. That's going to break up our friendship. You're going to be my boss. I said, but I have a wonderful idea. Why don't you make me a partner? They thought this was hilarious, and they rolled on the floor, clutching their stomachs. But don't you know, a year later, they called me in, and they gave me shares of the stock, and I became one of the co-owners of Atlantic Records. Whatever motivated them, I have no idea, because I had no visible qualifications except the talent for hanging out.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you at that time. Let's just roll back a little bit. How did you get the job at Billboard?
A job at Billboard, I was working at that time for BMI, the licensing organization, performing rights. And there was a man at working at BMI, Meyer Shapiro, who was an old Broadway publicist, an old hand, and he knew everything that was going on, and he knew there was an opening at Billboard, and he sent me over there. The music editor at that time who interviewed me was a man named Joe Carlton, who later started Carlton Records, and who had eventually become A&R head both at RCA and at Mercury. But this time he was working at Billboard, and so he interviewed me.
One
of the test questions he asked me was, "What label does Nat Cole record for?" I didn't have a clue. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, my ignorance was like unlimited. But
how come you didn't know that?
I mean, why should I? I mean, it was pop music, you know.
So you were still a jazz purist at the time.
Yeah. Now remember, I was not a reporter at this time. I was not a reviewer. I was a guy who was running around for a music publisher. I was imagining that I was getting their copyrights recorded by dint of my own personality and assiduity. For example, I'd go to see, well, I don't want to mention too many names, but I'd go to see the head man at RCA, the head man at Decca, the head man at Carl, and boy, I was getting records and I was getting covers. Joe Stafford was doing our tunes and so on, and I came back all pumped up. What I didn't know, that the fix was in, that I was merely the errand boy, and a little financial transaction had taken place. Later on, it became known as payola. But I was blissfully ignorant, and I didn't know that. I was just, you know, a messenger boy.
So it gave you some confidence, even if it was false confidence.
Exactly. Not only confidence, but hubris. I said, man, I'm good at this.